It started out like any other quiet day by the river, a place where my wife loved to sit and breathe in peace. She's pregnant, and the water has always been her way of calming her nerves, especially now when every step feels heavier than before. But what should have been a moment of peace turned into something none of us expected. Out of nowhere, a confrontation began. It wasn't just an argument. It was something that would change everything about how we saw our neighborhood, our so-called community, and the people who claim to run it. You see, our neighborhood has one of those HOA boards that think they control every corner of your life. And among them is one person who makes herself impossible to ignore. Some people call her nosy, others just call her Karen. For us, she became the face of every unfair rule, every unwanted lecture, and every ounce of unnecessary drama. That day, her temper reached a point that went too far. My wife, already vulnerable, was caught in the middle of her outburst, and in a moment that shocked everyone, the situation spiraled to a place that left us shaken and speechless. Imagine standing there, watching the person you love most in this world, your pregnant, disabled wife, being treated without even the smallest ounce of compassion. I could see the fear in her eyes and the disbelief on the faces of neighbors who happened to be nearby. Nobody could believe what had just happened, and neither could I. And while everyone else froze, my first instinct was to step in, to protect her, to make sure she was safe. But what happened next made the story even more unbelievable, because the drama didn't end by the river. It carried straight into the heart of our town, right where you'd least expect it, the police station. What started as a heated confrontation turned into a shocking twist involving marriage, betrayal, and justice. A moment of pure cruelty ended up unraveling secrets that had been hidden for far too long. And right there, in front of officers and people who thought they'd seen it all, the truth came out in the most public way possible. But the way it unfolded? That's the part that still leaves people stunned. And once you hear how the divorce papers were served, and who ended up being exposed in the process, you'll understand why this story is nothing like you've heard before. To understand how things got so out of hand, you have to know a little about the history between us and the HOA. From the day we moved into this neighborhood, it felt like we were under a microscope. Every small detail about our home seemed to bother someone on the board. They didn't like the color of our mailbox. They complained about how long our car sat in the driveway, and even questioned the way we landscaped our yard. At first, we tried to brush it off, thinking maybe they were just strict about the rules. But it soon became clear that we weren't being treated the same as everyone else. And at the center of it all was her, Karen. She carried herself like she was queen of the neighborhood, always pointing fingers, handing out warnings, and making sure everyone knew she was in charge. For most people, she was just an annoyance, someone to avoid. But for us, she seemed to have a special kind of grudge. Maybe it was because we didn't bow down to her demands, or maybe she just couldn't stand that we wouldn't play along with her control. Whatever it was, her behavior kept escalating, and each time it got harder to ignore. For my wife, it was more than just irritation. Being pregnant and living with a disability already makes day-to-day life a challenge. She needed peace, comfort, and understanding, not stress and conflict. But Karen had no patience for that. Instead of kindness, she gave her nothing but criticism, sometimes in front of neighbors, sometimes even shouting across the street. It was humiliating, and it hurt to see my wife being treated that way. The river, in many ways, was our escape from all of this. It was a quiet spot just beyond the noise of the neighborhood, where my wife could breathe, reflect, and feel free from all the pressure. It should have been safe, a place no one could disturb. But even there, the drama followed us. On that day, Karen showed up with the same energy she always carried, loud, accusing, and ready to pick a fight. Only this time, things went further than anyone could have imagined. The confrontation by the river left the neighborhood buzzing with rumors, and everyone seemed to have their own version of what really happened. But the strangest part was what happened afterward, at the police station, where the truth started to come out in ways no one expected. And when divorce papers suddenly entered the picture, the story turned from neighborhood drama into something much, much bigger. The strange thing about that day was how quickly everything spread. By the time we made it back from the river, half the neighborhood already seemed to know something had gone down. Some whispered that my wife had overreacted, Others claimed Karen was just protecting the rules. But those who had seen it with their own eyes knew the truth, that it went far beyond HOA politics. This wasn't just about rules or community standards anymore. It was about respect, dignity, and the way people treat one another when they think no one will hold them accountable. Karen, of course, wasted no time twisting the story. She went door to door, acting like she was the victim, telling people that my wife had provoked her. She leaned on her role in the HOA, pulling strings, calling in favors, trying to paint herself in the best possible light. But what she didn't count on was that some of the very people she thought were her allies had started to turn against her. Years of bossing around the neighborhood had built a quiet resentment, and now her behavior was giving them a reason to speak up. While all of this was playing out, another layer of drama surfaced, the one that shocked us most. At the police station, where we thought we'd simply give our side of the story, the situation took a sharp twist. It wasn't just about a statement anymore. That was where Karen's own husband showed up, papers in hand. And for once, she didn't have the upper hand. Right there, in front of officers and neighbors who had gathered, he served her divorce papers. The air in that room shifted instantly. People were stunned, whispering, piecing together the puzzle of what they'd just witnessed. From that moment, the story stopped being just ours. It became the neighborhood's. Everyone had questions. Why would her own husband take such a public step? How long had things been falling apart behind closed doors? And was what happened by the river just the breaking point in a much bigger picture? For me and my wife, the conflict became layered. On one side, we were still reeling from what she had done to us. On the other, we were watching her own life unravel in ways we hadn't expected. But instead of feeling resolved, it only made things more complicated. Because now the neighborhood was divided, some siding with us, others too afraid to let go of the woman who had ruled over them for years. And in the middle of all this chaos, we were left wondering what Karen would do next. The days after the police station incident felt like living inside a storm that refused to pass. Every time we stepped outside, we could feel the eyes of our neighbors following us, some with sympathy, others with quiet judgment. My wife, already struggling with the weight of pregnancy and her disability, was now carrying the emotional burden of being at the center of a scandal that had shaken the whole community. I tried to shield her from it, but gossip travels faster than truth, and everywhere we went, whispers followed. Karen, on the other hand, didn't disappear into the background like many expected. If anything, she came back louder, more determined to prove she was still in control. She marched around the neighborhood with papers in her hand, threatening citations, warning homeowners about violations, and reminding everyone she was still on the HOA board. But the cracks in her authority were clear. People avoided her, doors closed when she walked by, and the once powerful woman was now fighting harder than ever to hold on to a position that was slipping away. But what made it worse was the silence of her husband. After the shocking scene at the police station, he hadn't come back to their home. Neighbors whispered about where he was staying. Some claimed he'd been seen with a lawyer. Others said he was gathering evidence for something bigger. The uncertainty only fueled the tension. For the first time, Karen looked like someone cornered, and it was hard to tell what she might do if she felt like everything was slipping from her hands. Meanwhile, we couldn't ignore the feeling that we were being watched more closely than ever. Strange cars slowed down near our driveway. Notes with vague warnings appeared on our porch. Even late at night, we'd hear footsteps near the fence, only to find no one there when we checked. Whether it was Karen or someone trying to intimidate us on her behalf, we didn't know. But one thing was clear. The situation was building towards something much bigger than petty HOA drama. The breaking point came one evening when the HOA called an emergency meeting. The entire neighborhood showed up, the room packed with people who wanted answers. Karen sat at the front, her face tense, clutching her notes. My wife and I were seated in the middle, every eye on us, waiting to see what would unfold. The air was heavy, every word dripping with tension. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get any more heated, the moment arrived that would push everything to the edge of collapse. The HOA meeting started off with the usual formalities, but everyone could feel the tension buzzing in the room. Karen cleared her throat and tried to take control, rattling off rules, citing bylaws, and painting herself as the victim of what she called false accusations. But the energy was different this time. Neighbors weren't nodding along like before. They were leaning forward, whispering among themselves, waiting for something more. My wife sat quietly beside me, her hands resting on her belly, her face pale but determined. I could feel her trembling slightly, and I knew this wasn't just about us anymore. It was about the entire neighborhood deciding whether they'd continue living under fear or finally stand up. Then came the first surprise. A neighbor who had always kept to himself raised his hand. At first, no one thought much of it, but when he began speaking, the room shifted. He revealed he had recordings, conversations, late-night phone calls, even HOA discussions that exposed Karen bending rules, targeting certain families, and covering up violations when it benefited her friends. The murmurs turned into gasps, and suddenly, the image she had worked so hard to protect began to crumble in front of everyone. Karen's face flushed red as she tried to shout him down, but the damage was already done. Just when it seemed like she had lost her grip completely, the second twist came crashing down. The doors to the meeting room opened, and in walked her husband, calm, collected, with a stack of papers in his hand. Everyone turned, the silence almost deafening. He didn't look at her right away. Instead, he addressed the board and the neighbors. He revealed financial documents, transactions that didn't add up, HOA funds that had mysteriously disappeared. What had started as a feud between us and Karen was now something much bigger. Accusations of fraud, betrayal, and years of manipulation. Karen's composure cracked. She tried to dismiss him, calling it a personal matter. But no one was buying it anymore. The neighborhood wasn't just angry, they were stunned, realizing they'd been living under a leader who might have been using them all along. My wife gripped my hand tighter, her eyes wide, because we both knew this wasn't the end of it. If anything, the stakes had just risen to a level we hadn't imagined. And in that room, with the truth spilling out and the entire HOA hanging by a thread, everyone knew the climax was just around the corner. The meeting room erupted into chaos. Neighbors stood, shouting questions, demanding answers, and pointing fingers. For years, they had accepted Karen's word as law, but now the facade was breaking apart in real time. My wife sat steady beside me, her hand gripping mine, her eyes filled with both fear and relief. The truth was finally out, and there was no stopping it. Karen's husband placed the documents on the table, his voice firm as he explained how funds had been quietly siphoned away, how board members had been manipulated, and how the very people who trusted her were betrayed. Karen tried to fight back. She stood, voice raised, insisting it was all lies, that we had somehow orchestrated this entire spectacle. But the neighbors weren't buying it anymore. One after another, they spoke up, stories of unfair fines, sudden rules that seemed targeted, and the feeling of living under constant watch. The room shifted from shock to unity, and for the first time, it wasn't just us standing against her. The entire neighborhood was finally done with her reign. The climax hit when the board president, who had mostly stayed silent through the years, finally spoke up. He admitted he had ignored complaints out of fear of Karen's wrath. But with the evidence on the table and the voices in the room, he had no choice. He announced a vote right then and there, asking the community whether Karen should be removed from the HOA board permanently. Hands shot up across the room, one after another, until it was unanimous. Karen stood frozen, her face pale, her power gone in a single moment. But just when everyone thought it was over, the final twist arrived. As her husband gathered his papers, he revealed something none of us saw coming. He wasn't just serving her divorce, he was pressing charges. He had already been working with investigators, and the police had enough evidence to open a case. The room went silent, the weight of it settling over everyone. What began as petty neighborhood drama had turned into something far bigger, with consequences none of us could have predicted. As Karen stormed out of the room, her footsteps echoing against the walls, I looked at my wife. She was exhausted but smiling faintly, knowing we had finally stood our ground. The neighborhood was free, the truth was out, but the fallout from that night was only just beginning. When the meeting finally ended, the air in the room felt lighter, almost like a weight had been lifted off everyone's shoulders. Neighbors who had barely spoken to one another in years lingered, sharing stories, shaking hands, and promising to rebuild the community in a way that actually felt fair. For the first time, People weren't looking over their shoulders, worried about who might report them for some small detail. It felt like the neighborhood could finally breathe again. For my wife and me, the resolution brought peace we hadn't felt in a long time. After months of tension and conflict, she could finally rest without fear of being singled out or humiliated. The river once again became a place of calm instead of a reminder of pain. With the HOA restructured and new leadership chosen, the atmosphere around our home changed completely. Instead of icy stares and whispers, neighbors began checking in, offering support, and treating us with the kindness we had wanted all along. Karen, on the other hand, was no longer a presence in our daily lives. With the divorce underway and the investigation hanging over her, she disappeared from the neighborhood. Some said she had moved in with family. Others guessed she was staying quiet while her legal troubles played out. Whatever the truth was, the power she once held over everyone was gone, and in its place was a lesson the whole community would never forget. Looking back, the story wasn't just about one woman's need for control or the unfair rules of an HOA. It was about standing up for what's right, even when it feels like you're standing alone. It was about protecting family, holding on to dignity, and not letting fear silence you. My wife's strength through it all, despite her pregnancy and the challenges she faced, became the heart of this story. She showed me, and the whole neighborhood, that courage doesn't always look loud or fierce. Sometimes it looks quiet, steady, and unshakable. In the end, what happened brought the neighborhood closer together. The drama, the twists, the courtroom-worthy showdown, all of it left us with one clear takeaway. Power built on fear never lasts. True community comes from compassion, fairness, and the willingness to stand side by side when it matters most. And that was the real ending to this chapter of our lives.